Welcome to Rite Gud, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm Raquel S. Benedict, the most dangerous woman in speculative fiction. In 1936, anthropologist Ralph Linton said, "The last thing a fish would ever notice would be water." It's difficult to see the medium that encompasses everything around you, especially when you've never known anything else. If fish were contemporary sci fi fantasy readers, the last thing they would notice is Squeecore. What is Squeecore? You're soaking in it. Squeecore is the dominant literary movement in contemporary SFF, a movement so ubiquitous it's nearly invisible. But in this episode, we are taking notice of how speculative fiction got watered down. Joining me in the fishbowl is JR of the Podhand. JR, where did the term Squeecore come from? I feel like I heard it from you.
I have definitely said it, but I did not coin the phrase. I'm sure it's been kicking around elsewhere, but our Halvey on the Discord came up with that, as far as I know.
I think I asked Halvey, and Halvey said, "Oh, I heard it from somebody else." So it's been kicking around. But the instant you hear the term "Squeecore," you go, "God, that's right. That's it. That's perfect." You instantly recognize it, and you realize, yes.
I think so.
You just suddenly figure out, yes, that fits. That fits what this fucking thing is.
Yeah, and we have used it more or less as a disparaging term, but I'm sure there were people who would gladly call themselves squeakcore because is not squee a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who use the term squee in a positive sense, unironically. So I suppose squeecore wouldn't bother them. So I guess it fits. So why are we taking the time to define squeecore? Why are we taking the time to coin this term and talk about it? Well, most artistic or literary movements have a name, either made up by the people involved in it or made up by people who are not involved in it and don't really like it very much and kind of started as an insult. And most eras in sci fi fantasy have a name. We have the Golden Age, we have New Wave, Cyberpunk, New Weird, Bizarro, so on and so forth. And from what I could tell, most cyberpunks were pretty comfortable saying, yeah, I'm writing cyberpunk. There was a movement with a certain aesthetic, certain tendencies, and there was often a sort of political ideology that went along with it. Like cyberpunk tended to be anti capitalist, or at least looking at the decay of late capitalism. New wave tended to be, I guess, a little left libertarian. Golden Age was very conservative and very like age of imperialism, pro imperialism, I'd say.
Not globally, but yes. And then New Weird, of course, is broadly leftist.
Right. So right now, I think there is a dominant style and tone in speculative fiction, and I think it deserves a name. I think leaving it without a name gives us this sense that this is everything, this is the alpha and the omega, and not this is a trend. Because once you
Right.
realize, okay, this is part of a movement, this is a trend, this is a particular style, you start realizing it's ubiquitous, and then you ask, why is this everywhere? Why isn't there room for anything else? And when you realize this is a movement, it means maybe there's room for a new movement to come in and push it out.
It's a movement that doesn't realize it's a movement or it hasn't named itself.
Right,
It's the this is water sort of thing. It is
right, which I
it's an
find kind of
unquestioned
interesting.
right, and like those other movements, it does have an ideology, but nobody speaks of it. Well, no,
Yeah,
I wouldn't say nobody. The sad puppies and the assorted online mutants have definitely talked about it, but only in terms of condemning the diversity push and the broadly
right.
liberal identitarian stuff. But that's not what we're talking about.
No, we're kind of going to focus maybe a little bit about the politics of it, but heavily on the aesthetic of it. And personally, I feel like refusing to name your movement or admit that you're part of a movement, keeping it invisible is almost it's insidious in a way because it makes it harder to present an alternative. Like,
Yeah,
"Oh, I'm everything. I'm the norm." Those other people it's like when people say that they don't have an ideology or I don't have an accent, like, yes, you
exactly.
do.
Yeah.
Yes, you do. You just don't know it.
Yep. And it's always people in the dominant ideology that do that
Right. I don't have
because they
knowledge
don't see it for what it
ideology.
is. They don't have
Absolutely, you
to.
do. You yes, you do. Everyone does, and
Yep.
that's okay. I mean, that's normal. It's just you're even more you can't even question your own ideas when you don't understand that it's an ideology and there are alternatives, I think. Okay.
Yeah.
So that said, let's talk about what is Squeecore? What are the characteristics of Squeecore, at least? Well, mostly, let's start with the aesthetics. And tonally, Squeecore tends to be very uplifting and upbeat. It's didactic. There's almost a weird, like, YA-ish, young adult fiction tone to it, even when it's supposed to be for adults. Someone in our Discord, Kurt, pointed this out. Characters feel weirdly young, like they always think and act and feel as though they're in their late teens or early 20s. They're kind of
Mhm.
inexperienced, naive, still very full of wonder, and you get the sense they haven't really lived a life before the story began.
You could probably attribute a lot of that to, of course, to the YA thing that blew up in the last 20 years since Harry Potter. But there's also a lot of influence from films, and a lot of influence from mainstream commercial narratives, the MCU, the She-Ras, and the the Save the Cat style 3 act structure screenplays that have really become the blueprint for a lot of storytelling.
Right. They almost feel like kind of bad RPG protagonists, those silent protagonists that were very popular in the 90s that don't really have personalities. It's
Yeah,
just
the
you're the player character. Put yourself in there. And I've been trying to figure out why, because for me, characters who are a little older, who've lived a life, who have maybe they have a haunted past and terrible secrets and regrets, and there's something driving them toward this need to redeem themselves, but it never really tells you what it is. Like, I love that shit. That's the good shit.
yeah, and
Characters who've seen too much and are kind of haunted, but you don't know what it is. Like, oh hell yeah, that's so
yeah,
good.
absolutely. And the older I get, the more I gravitate toward older protagonists as well, because I have nothing to learn
Hmm.
from a teenager, right? Or a
Right.
57-year-old HR manager who writes like a teenager and two teenagers.
Yeah, and it's such a strange thing. I'm wondering if it's because of their we have this need to eliminate or fill negative space. We need to explain everyone's motivations. We can't just let a character be the way they are. We have to have some kind of detailed flashback to the traumatic experience that made them this way. And that takes up a lot of space. So in order to avoid having to do that, we just have these kind of flat, like JRPG from the 90s protagonists that
Yeah,
feel
and of
that are
course
always on the cusp of their life journey and they haven't lived.
yeah, I mean
Go
that's
ahead.
a sacred trope in sci-fi fantasy. It's always a convenient shorthand to have like a naive protagonist that you can explain, especially a secondary world to, because they're just like sieves for information, right? You just have
Yeah.
people talk at them, and that's
Yeah,
not
but
even
that's
always
not always
bad.
been the case. I mean, so many of Bradbury's protagonists were married men.
Burroughs had his druggies and his writers, and J.G. Ballard had his like retirees in the Vermilion Sands, and there was a much greater variety of characters. I feel, especially in the new wave.
Oh yeah, they loved strange, broken weirdos, and it was awesome.
But maybe we
Yeah,
should talk about.
and I'm not saying that there's anything. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. There's a time delay between our speech. We're on opposite coast. You are in New York, and I am in Vancouver, BC.
Oh
So that
yeah,
that
that must be
explains a
it.
lot. We have a 3 hour time zone
Yeah,
difference.
exactly. We're just attaching our messages to carrier pigeons and sending them back and forth, so it's not
Yeah,
working
I'm
very well.
spinning a big wheel.
They got
There's
to
like
go through
a
Canadian
semaphore
customs.
tower
It's
I got
pretty
to do.
strict. It's got to get translated to French and back.
Yeah, it's
Keep the
illegal for me to
Quebecois
talk if
happy.
there's not half French, as it should be. We love our French people,
That's
French
right.
Canadians.
Of course, who doesn't love the French? Who
Who
doesn't?
doesn't? Open question.
Oh gosh. So, sorry, what were you saying?
I was gonna say we could go back and talk about like what is squee. If we're gonna call it squeecore, we have to say what is the definition of squee.
Mhm.
That horrible, horrible word.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
have a little, as I defined it,
So what
squee
is the
is a
definition of squee?
yeah. As squee is a geek culture term for a sound or expression of excitement or enthusiasm. It's the opposite of feh or meh and very close kin to amazeballs and epic sauce. It represents a specific feeling, a type of
Mm.
frisson that readers value, the tingle of relatability as a beloved character does something cool or says something epic and snarky. The essence of Squee is wish fulfillment. Squeecore lives for the hell yeah moment, the you go girl moment, the gushy feeling of victory by proxy. It's aspirational, it's escapism, it's a dominant, and I would even say gentrified form of SFF.
Can you articulate a little bit more by what you mean by gentrified SFF?
Well, I think as we've seen, there's been a professionalization of the genre. As it's become more popular, there's a lot of careers being made a lot quicker, and a lot of people who've seen sci-fi fantasy as an avenue to, a big career, like a Hollywood level career. And in some cases, that's definitely panned out. I mean, you have George R. R. Martin, of course, you have Robert Jordan, you have J.K. Rowling, however you pronounce this, and you have these big aspirational figures now in sci-fi fantasy. And there have always been superstar writers. That's never been a question. But specifically in sci-fi fantasy, you have literal billionaires who started as writers, and a lot of people see that as an inspiration to become like that. And that's attracted a
Mm.
lot of sharks, a lot of professional sharks.
The idea of
And
going into writing fiction to make money to me seems a little crazy. It's like a shark going to swim in a puddle, like in one of those like oily rainbow puddles. Like, bro, you are in. What are you doing? Go home.
yeah, if you get a big enough shark, it'll eat all the smaller fish, and that's definitely what we're
Yeah.
seeing.
You said there's a professionalism because there's this HR ishness. You feel a lot like you're talking to a human resources person, someone from the professional middle class. When you read these, you get the
Mm-hmm.
feeling the writers aren't working class or poor. I always get the feeling that a lot of these writers have only ever been customers and have never been the customer service representative. There's this real strong feeling of I want to talk to the manager in a lot of these stories, and I believe that that's the happy ending to Cold Calculations is basically someone goes to talk to the manager to solve the problem. I don't know, I guess we're going to go talk to the manager of physics. We're going to
Yep.
go talk to Sir Isaac Newton. I don't know.
I'm going to talk to the manager of goblins and tell him to knock off all that malarkey.
Yeah. I would like you to fix gravity, sir.
Can you warm up these
Anyways, ugh,
calculations?
they're very cold.
They're very cold. They're
I'm
too cold.
uncomfortable.
Take it back.
They're too cold.
But I think
Oh
that's
gosh.
broadly it's sort of a tendency in the writers themselves, because as less people start out with the ability to make living income with writing, it sort of becomes a hobby. But at the same time, the people with all the free time are the sort of white collar professionals who have the ability and the money to network and to have all the leisure time to write and to pay attention to the submission grinder and do all these things that maybe a working class person doesn't have time to do, especially now.
Right, someone working multiple jobs and working blue collar jobs where you don't have downtime, where in most white collar jobs, you can usually squeeze out an hour a day to write. You can
Yeah, I'm
usually, if you work really efficiently, you can squeeze out a little bit of time to write. If you are waiting tables, you really can't do that. You rest your feet for 2 seconds and your boss barks at you. You got time to lean, you got time to clean.
yeah, and of
That's
course
it.
there's a lot of wonderful working class writers, but they're not really being published because they're out of the zone, they're out of the clique.
Connections unfortunately do play a huge role in what gets published. You see pretty frequently in SFF magazines. Whenever I see a story that looks kind of mediocre and I'm like, how did I get published? I look down and I always find out that according to the writer's bio, the writer is an alumna of one of the same workshops that the editors are an alumna of. It's like, oh,
Yes,
okay, you're in
it's
the same
very
club.
much
And it's this club
professional
giving each
networking.
other, publishing each other's works and giving each other awards. This is what it is. And the club costs $5,000.
Yep.
So if you don't have that, you can't get in. And maybe you can sneak in if you're fucking an amazing writer, but it's definitely an uphill battle for you in a way that it isn't for other people. And chances are you might have a different sensibility than other people are will have. There's very much a certain type of, I don't know, socializing that's acceptable, where it's like that very waspy passive aggressive condescension is okay, but being direct and straightforward in a way that a sort of working class person might be, that a person from a non waspy culture might be, gets you branded as unsafe and abusive. Like, think to the
Yeah,
time
that's
that I forget what writer it was. Remember the time that one writer said that Bernie Sanders was like an abusive dad because he yells sometimes, and it's like
yeah, that's definitely a politically motivated attack.
he's an old Jewish New Yorker. That's if you're from New York, that is how you talk. That is your inside voice is yelling. I'm like from a Puerto Rican family. That yelling is the normal sound.
Yeah, and pointing
It
your
is totally
finger like you
normal and
know things.
acceptable to tell someone, "Hey, fuck you," and that's okay. It's not abuse. It's just being direct, and I find it a lot more acceptable for me than just disgusting dripping condescension.
Yeah. How dare Saint Bernard swing his finger around in an accusatory manner? How dare he?
Like, he's an old New York man. That is the normal way of talking when you get excited. Ugh. And that culture of communication, I think, bleeds into the work too. I find a very strong discomfort with emotion. Emotion is either dealt with in terms of like, okay, emotions are something to manage in therapy, or we get mawkish maudlin sentimentality, or we get this glibness to it where anytime anything really interesting happens, instead of really leaning into it and the feeling, we get some kind of little Whedon-esque like, well, that happened kind of quip to undercut the emotional strength of it. And I find it such a disappointment because, like, no, let me feel this. Let me feel these feelings. If you go into melodrama a little bit, that can be okay. Melodramas can be really appealing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I have no problem with sentimentality. Some of the best stories are made of it, and broad melodramatic displays of emotion and this sort of an heightened operatic storytelling. I have no problem with that at all. I love it, even when it can be manipulative, which it definitely can be. But at least if I sense that it's honest, or if the writer tricks me into thinking that it's honest, then you get catharsis out of that. It can be quite wonderful. But I don't feel like that's even the dominant thing now, because it's too honest. It's too vulnerable.
Yeah.
You get it on TV sometimes with melodramas. You get it on Riverdale even, but a lot of current books are they're more snarky and reserved, and their tone is much more not vulnerable. I will say that.
Right, which is a shame because I mean, art is a place to let your emotions go wild. Let them out. It's all right. That's what art is for. Yeah, some people might call it cringe or whatever, but you know what? It fucking rocks. You have to get it. It's genre fiction. It's
Yeah.
going to be cringe. You're writing about dragons. Just fucking
Embrace
go
your inner
for it.
cringe.
Absolutely, go for it. Go for it like you're doing a fucking prog rock guitar solo or
Exactly.
something.
If you
Like, just
embrace
really
your
lean
inner
into
like
it.
rhapsody, your hammerfall, your power metal,
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
and there's an
It's an
honesty
absolute
there that I've
blast.
always loved, and that's why I love classic fantasy, and that's what got me into the genre in the first place.
Yeah, it feels very emotionally honest, even when it's, like, totally over the top, but w
Yeah, even when it is the most
that's
cringe.
what's fun about
In
it.
fact,
You just get the
something
feeling
that
that
makes you
whoever's writing it
cringe,
is going like, "Yeah!"
something that feels metal.
Yeah, it really does. Metal or one of those prog rock bands that's all about, like, here's a concept album about a future in which a dystopian cyber future in which music is illegal.
Yep.
And you're just
I'm
like,
not going to play notes. I'm
"Yes."
going to play equilateral triangles for 20 minutes, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So yeah, there's that PMCS fear of emotion. There's a lyricism, but it feels very middlebrow lyricism. There are a lot of metaphors that sound cool on the surface, but fall apart when you examine them.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we're resisting the tendency, or resisting the temptation, I should say, to name specific works because we've
I
read enough
know,
at
I
this point.
know.
I mean, there's no reason to go in on a particular author, although the temptation is there. Some of
It
them are
sure
fucking
is.
asking for it, but we are not going to do that.
No, at least not yet. Anyway.
We're just identifying broader trends, I think, which is
Right,
trying to put a
right.
name
There's
to
a
the
course.
feeling, really.
Right. And when you start feeling the trend, you start seeing this shit's everywhere. Ugh. Let's see, the sense of humor, it's very colloquialism, it's very snarky, um,
Epically
as you
snarky,
put
I would
it.
even
It's
say.
very stuck in early 2000s epic bacon blogger humor. There's a lot of
Yeah.
focus on sarcasm and banter as a substitute for jokes. Very online prose, cromulent douchewaffle type zingers, that kind of thing. It's a person who's not very funny trying to be funny.
Yes, that is a plague.
It's
And
bad. It's bad.
more than that, they really do lean on self-aware deconstructions of sci-fi fantasy tropes.
Right.
They have to show off how self-aware they are by not just subverting in the way that George R. R. Martin say subverted high fantasy tropes, but by, I hate to use this term, but lampshading. They deliberately
Right.
call back to like narratology and the tropes themselves in the story and make you aware that you're reading a story in a very glib way, in a way that feels like the 90s wave of deconstruction, Scream, Buffy, and then later on Shaun of the Dead, that sort of thing. And
Right.
I'm not
It's not
criticizing
enough to
those
just
things. I mean, if
deconstruct
you like
something. They
those,
have to
go
tell you,
ahead.
"See, look, I'm deconstructing it. See what I'm doing
Yeah,
here? Do you get it? Do you
and
get it?
not
You're
just that,
so smart. You're so smart for enjoying this."
but it also has to be perceived as an attack on older work. It has to be like, oh, I'm better
Yes.
than the old stuff. I'm commenting on that and I'm deconstructing this because I'm better.
Yeah, there's a lot of generals fighting the last war. There's a lot of fighting something from 30 years ago. There's a sense that it's stuck in the past. There's a lot of treating discussions we've been having for decades like they're brilliant new ideas. Like, how many stories do we have now that mention final girls? Like, that Men, Women, and
Boy.
Chainsaw book came out, what, 20, 30 years ago? Final girl is not a new concept. The final girl is like, we know what it is. Or red shirts. I mean, a book called Red Shirts won the Hugos, I think, a couple of years ago. Eddie
Right.
Izzard had a routine about red shirts in the 1990s. This is
Yeah.
a 25-year-old Eddie Izzard routine, and we're
I
treating it
mean,
like, holy shit, this blew my mind.
yeah, Galaxy Quest came out coming up on 25 years ago now. Like, there's
Right.
nothing new
It,
to
it's
say
been
about that
done.
stuff. And I
And
love
they did
Galaxy
it
Quest, don't
great.
get
They
me
did.
wrong.
Oh, it's hilarious.
It's one of the
They
greatest
already did
comedies
it,
I've
and
read.
we're acting like, "Oh, wow, you pointed out the red shirt guys always die." Like, yeah, it's a hack comedy now. Now, it's the equivalent of standing up there and writing a sci-fi book called "What's the Deal with Airline Food?"
But I think there's like a cultural rut in general, not just in sci-fi fantasy, but everywhere, where we're sort of
Yeah,
stuck in like a holding pattern of culture where we can't really invent anything new. And I'm as guilty as anyone of that, but it's not that there's nothing new to say, but under the sort of culture and the economic conditions that we have, there's only so much that can be really said that's new because nothing has really changed
right.
culturally except to get worse.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of rehashing old arguments and struggles that aren't true anymore. Like, I still see a lot of stories that have a main character being an outcast for being too geeky. It's not the 80s anymore. Video games are mainstream. Star Wars is mainstream. It's not no one's gonna beat you up for, like, watching Star Wars because everybody watches
Yeah,
Star Wars. No one's gonna make fun of you for playing video games because everyone plays video. The frattiest of frat brothers play video games. Your mom probably plays video games. Everyone does. There's this very weird sense of a lot of these folks still think it's the 1980s, and it is not. For better and for worse, it is not. I mean, in some ways, we're eternally stuck in Reaganomics, but The culture's moved on.
Reaganomics is probably why we're stuck in this holding pattern, because we're still in Reaganomics. We are in the cyberpunk present. And so we just recycle the last 40 years of culture and vulture
Yeah.
around what came before. But it's I would say that there are shining cracks that show new things, but the dominant trend has been this recycling over and over.
Right. I mean, it's safe, it's familiar, it makes money. People
Yep.
gravitate to this thing because they've heard of it, even though none of these things are going to outlast the thing they're riffing on. There have been many, many response stories to the ones who walk away from Omelas. None of these stories are going to be remembered as long as Ursula Le Guin's original story. And most of
Right.
these responses are terrible because they just take it as a surface level plot going, I'd rescue the kid, and not saying like it's the trolley problem. It's not a Rubik's cube. The purpose is it's a philosophical question to make you think about who you are and what your values are and who you are in society. It's not like, oh, I'll save the kid. And also you will not save the kid. You will not save the kid. I'm sorry. You're not going to save the kid. So there's the stuck in the
Transmuting.
past. There's the great influences are from TV and movies and not literature, which is a real shame because a lot of really great genre writers, you can very clearly tell, like, oh, this guy read Moby Dick. Like John Langan, if you're reading The Fisherman, it's very clear that man read Moby Dick and that he fucking loves
Hmm.
Moby Dick. You can absolutely see it in there. And Tolkien, he read old, I think, Icelandic sagas.
Yes, he
Ursula Le
did.
Guin studied anthropology. There was this immense curiosity for the world and for older literature that goes in there, and it's lacking. There's an intense incuriosity. There's an intense refusal to look beyond a very narrow group of canonical genre works. And the only way we're going to look at it either is for cheap, lazy references or to say, I defeated it. I won. I beat H.P. Lovecraft by writing a response story to him. I defeated a dead person. Hooray for me.
Yep.
Mm.
And because he was one of the bad dead people, I deserve to be congratulated for it.
Yeah. Like, if you want to defeat H.P. Lovecraft, create something cool and exciting
Make
in
something
horror that
scarier.
makes people stop caring. Make something cool so that no one cares about Cthulhu anymore. That is how
Yep.
you'd fucking beat him. And you're not going to do that by just writing more Lovecraft spin-offs where you yell at the corpse. But let's talk a little bit about ideology. We've been talking about aesthetic and talk a bit about ideology because there is an ideology to every movement, and Squeecore definitely has an ideology. I think of centrist, solidly capitalist, vaguely liberalism.
It's extremely liberal. It's neoliberal.
Now, do you want to define neoliberal just because that's a term that gets thrown around a lot?
Right. Well, neoliberalism was, I think it first dropped in reference to Pinochet's regime. Neoliberalism was of the Chicago school. It was an economic policy that championed the free market in international trade as almost like a replacement for diplomacy. And it has become the dominant ideology of all of Western capitalism. It's wrapped up globally. It defines global capitalism in
Okay, I get it. So basically, it's like everything, the market is everything, and the market is the only way to understand the world, the only way to make action happen. And everything is meant to be put up to the market, whether it's a
yeah.
public good or a consumer object, whether it's our access to clean air or Funko Pops. Let the market decide.
Yeah, it is a commodification of things that should be the commons, but more than that, it's It's the underlying belief is that the market can lift up all ships, that international trade can raise up every nation from poverty and enter into sort of golden age of capitalism where everybody's on an equal plane and all so-called third world nations are now developed because of capitalism. And the neoliberals can point to certain bar graphs of line goes up that are good, of GDP, of education and literacy. But of course, there are massive consequences for this that are externalities that we're seeing in the environment, and we're seeing in the human death toll of exploitation, and we're seeing in these undeclared sort of proxy wars over resources. And that's all neoliberal
Right.
policy. And it's sort of this very sunny, sanded off belief that mega corporations are, they might be evil, but they can do some good. So who's to say what's good or bad, right?
Right.
Amazon may be exploitative, but they get me my tendies on time, and hey, it's better than being unemployed.
Right. That is something I've noticed, this embrace of the corporation. I mean, a lot of these stories will have an evil corporation or an evil CEO, but they're not really all that against corporatism at all. I know, was it Clarion West had a diversity panel sponsored by Amazon? And Amazon is, I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
notoriously, it mistreats employees, and many of its employees are marginalized people. If you're a working class population, we're talking about quite a number of Black, Latinx, and immigrant workers. So if you're treating your working class people like shit, by default, you are
Mm-hmm.
treating diverse people like shit. And the concept that it might not be a great idea to take money from this company and help whitewash their really negative image. There's no concept like maybe we shouldn't do that. I've seen so many Squeecore authors get mad about piracy, and to be fair, it can be frustrating. Like, shit, I spent, I worked on this book for like 3 years. You won't even pay like $5 for it? Come on. But nothing about
Yeah.
how bad Amazon treats authors, and the way that Amazon runs its business, how bad it's really squeezed writers and how hard it's been for writers. There's little to no criticism for it, which I find bizarre. And I think the ultimate in it is this thing that, as of recording, is very recent, was the Hugo Award Worldcon ceremony being sponsored by Raytheon, astonishingly evil weapons manufacturer, and winners going up there and talking about how their successes are a victory for marginalized people and how it's so cool that we had so many diverse winners, which, that is, I think that is a good thing, of course. More
Yes.
diverse winners, more women winners, that's good. But to be sponsored by Raytheon, no. I don't think I
So
have to
funny.
articulate to
I
our
mean,
listeners why that's not acceptable.
my first reaction was to be disgusted and outraged, but more than that, it's funny. For one, it's hilarious. And it also proves
Right.
everything we've been talking about for months, if not years, about the professionalization of sci-fi fantasy, about the sort of
Just the
grasping
utter
careerism.
hollowness of it.
Yeah, and this the
The
moral
hollowness
hollowness,
of it.
the constant equivocation, and the sort of mealy-mouthed approach to these moral compromises that they're so strident about in fiction, but they cannot make a moral decision in real life. They have to prevaricate and
Right.
equivocate and just flip flop back and forth about, oh, maybe Raytheon isn't so bad because they also made my microwave oven, and that microwaves are good. Everyone likes a microwave, right, folks?
Right.
It's pathetic.
It's deeply,
You
deeply
can't They
disturbing,
can't
but
say outright Raytheon is evil. They've murdered thousands of people. They have a bomb that has
right,
swords in it to kill children in Yemen. Like they are demons.
right.
And you can't just say that. You can't tweet it. You can't just like take
You can't
a
even tweet it
stand against
afterward. You can't even say, like,
the
"While I was at
archetypal
the
evil
ceremony, I got
corporation.
kind of blindsided and got overwhelmed, but in retrospect, holy shit, that was fucked up."
Yeah.
Like, you could just say that. Like,
Or if
"Hey, at the
you
time, I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't say anything, but now looking back on it, like, wow, that was not appropriate."
Yeah, or if you don't know who Raytheon is, why the fuck do you consider yourself a sci-fi writer if you're not tuned into like literally anything that's happening in reality? You
Yeah,
should know
honestly,
who
yeah,
Raytheon
like,
is
you
if you
should
call
know.
yourself a citizen of the
You
world,
should
not just a
you should
leftist
have the
like some
intellectual
douchebag was saying, but
curiosity.
anyone, you should read the news once in a while. And
Yeah,
maybe don't have
yeah,
your partner work for them. I don't know. I'm not sure what's their
yeah.
name.
Look, she wants is to make George R. R. Martin fuck off into the sun, so
Well,
she
now we know
married
how they're going to get
someone
him there.
who will literally be able to do that.
That's right.
Oh my god. But yeah, as morally compromised as they are in real life, their stories are very black and white moral message stories. And I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with putting writing a story that's political. My stories are all political. I think everyone's stories are political in some way or another. Our politics get into what we write. But there's
Yep.
a difference between your politics getting into what you write and versus standing on a soapbox and screaming at people and delivering a sermon, which it's not bad necessarily. Sometimes they're okay. I mean, I liked Sorry to Bother You, and that was totally a sermon. It was absolutely a sermon, but I enjoyed it. But
There is nothing wrong with sermons in fiction.
over and over, they're all
Super
sermons, and they're all super blunt with really blunt symbolism, really black and white morality, clear-cut villains.
and they completely fail when it comes to real life villainy.
And the stories all feel like an Aesop's fable told to children, but I'm an adult.
Yeah.
I'm an adult. I don't need these things explained to me in quite this way. It's okay for me to see a scenario and just absorb it and not have a character deliver the message like at the end of a fucking GI Joe episode. You can just
Yeah,
please,
or
please trust me. Please.
shouting the slogan perhaps while in labor to make up a totally like fake scenario that never happened in a story that was won a lot of awards. I'm not going to say nothing more about that.
No, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're
I don't
talking
know.
about.
No one
But
would ever do that. No one would ever.
there's also there's also an emphasis on diversity, but kind of token diversity is jammed into riffs on old works. I'm thinking of the all woman Ghostbusters remake, and these token characters have to be exemplary and good. They can't be complicated because then you're negatively stereotyping. In my opinion, that's just sticking to model minority stereotypes, which are extremely harmful
Yeah.
standards to apply to people. Oh, you have to be perfect because you're not white. Like, shit. That's too hard. I don't ask me to do that.
Well,
And
about
it's
Lady
not enough for them
Ghostbusters,
to put. Yeah.
it is the second best Ghostbusters movie.
Ooh, spicy.
That's not spicy. That's
I
just
have
fact.
not seen it, so I can't really weigh in.
It's not
But
bad. It's not near as bad as people say, but it's not good either. It's thoroughly mid.
that would fair enough. That I mean, that is what one should expect from a Ghostbusters reboot for it to be okay.
But
Um,
it's a
but
great example of what you're saying. It is sort of the Hollywood diversity of just sort of slotting in a different identity into the same story, which can, like, to its benefit, it can recontextualize an older work if it's got a mind to comment on it. But if it doesn't, then it's just window dressing.
yeah,
And I think diversity
yeah,
is
and
good unto
it's not
itself. I
telling a
mean,
new story either.
I mean, obviously, diversity is a good unto itself. If you have a story that's all white people for no reason and a story that's all people of color for no reason, the one of people of color reflects our daily reality and the experiences of more people, so that's the better story. I mean, that's the equality of
Right,
it, right? But just slotting
right.
in these characters, because it's not always the writers of color creating them. There's often just like white
Oh,
writers
of course.
behind all these things, especially in film and TV. In
Yeah.
prose, maybe it's a little better, but Hollywood is still extremely stratified and white, and you will have this sort
I
of
mean, it depends on the stories you're telling. Something I've found overwhelmingly by talking to other Latinx writers is that if you stick a Latinx character into a standard SFF narrative, that'll sell. But if you try to tell a story that's much more Latinx, let's say it's much more influenced by magical realism, or it goes in detail about Puerto Rican culture, or it's about colonization, it's about being Latinx, or deals with being Latinx in a complex way, and you're going to have a much harder time selling it. Or if you do
mhm,
sell it, it's not going to get as much positive buzz. It's not going to get as many positive reviews. And I've seen that overwhelmingly. I've seen
yes,
white non Latinx writers jam a Latinx token into their stories, into their generic stories, and do really, really well. And then meanwhile, like, I know Carlo Jaeger Rodriguez has had so much fucking trouble selling how Juan Bobo got to Nueva York, and it's a really fucking good story, but it's about a Puerto Rican folk hero, and it's about how assimilation to the United States might not really be a good thing completely. And
Yeah,
he had a really hard time selling that because that is a really Puerto Rican story. So it's a very shallow kind of diversity. It's like eating at a Chipotle instead of going to an actual Mexican-owned restaurant. That's the kind of diversity they fucking want.
yeah, and even authors of color and people of different cultures are pressed to fit into a Western narrative style. For instance, I read this
Yeah.
book recently last year. It's called Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, and she's a Mexican author. And her story was it's about a 200-page novel. It's short-ish, but it's written in a very dense stream of consciousness style, and it's extremely dark. It's about
Mm.
a small town and a woman who is reputed to be the town witch, and all the horrible things that happen to her, and the dramatic
Ooh,
politics that she gets wrapped up in with the town. It's very disturbing stuff. It's not
sounds
fantasy or
awesome.
sci-fi, although it sort of borders on almost a magical realism because it was sort of inspired by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, if I'm pronouncing that
Right.
right. And
Yeah.
and this sort of stream of consciousness, this very dense, poetic prose style, and it was well reviewed. I loved the book. There's wonderful, wonderful writing, but that is not the dominant style of sci-fi fantasy or of even lit fic, if you want to use that term.
Right.
And I think that limited its audience because it was not playing into the easy Western assimilation or the easily consumable product that you would see in most sci-fi
Mm.
fantasy, especially.
Yeah. It it it's these are stories that are congratulating you for reading them without really challenging you. They're telling you you're so special and good for reading this. And a major feature of Squeecore is treating the act of making or consuming Squeecore fiction as a heroic political act in and of itself.
Mm.
A writer I shall not name was promoting the work of a friend writer of his that I also shall not name, posting her story saying, "This is justice." No, it's a story, dude. It's not justice, it doesn't do anything, it is a story. You read it and then you go on with your life. It accomplishes nothing, and you could say, like, "This is a great story, I loved it. This is really cathartic." Yeah, sure, that's real, but saying, "This fictional story about a spaceman, that's justice." No, the fuck it is not. Go outside, do some mutual aid work, touch some fucking grass, go to a demonstration, I don't know. But writing or reading a fictional story is not activism. It's not justice. It doesn't fucking do anything. It's incredibly self-important to tell yourself
Yeah,
that you're literally changing the world. And there is that incredible belief in Squeecore about the power of language to change the world. And I'm not going to say that like fiction is totally worthless. Yeah, you can inspire people or change people's minds,
yeah,
but
and
they really treat it as a magical incantation that can shift the material reality for good or for ill. And if you write a story that's uplifting, you're doing this fucking spell that's going to fix things. And if you write a story that's upsetting, you are committing harm against people. Like if you repurpose a transphobic joke meme in the title of your story, you have committed harm. It's like you've spoken the Arva Cadavra curse and someone's going to literally die.
yeah.
Nah, it's just words. It's just words.
It seems to be. I don't know if this. I'm talking about my ass, but it seems to be an American phenomenon. This thought over matter sort of cargo cult belief, almost, where you can sort of
That does sound
manifest
about
into
right.
reality through
Yeah,
words.
that does sound
And
really
there are
keeping in terms of the bullshit American self-help movements of the past 100 years.
Yeah, and there are certain ways in which fiction can affect the world directly.
Was that a
Upton
different
Sinclair, right,
Sinclair?
with The Jungle, he published that
Mhm.
book as a novel. It was a novel. It wasn't a screed, but it
Right.
contained screeds in it, and it just showed the working class and the meat packers who lived on this in this horrible neighborhood. And it was so popular, and it was originally much more of a class. story. Like if you read it, there's a class narrative there, but people really latched on to the work conditions in the slaughterhouses and the meat packing, and that's what
Right.
eventually became. It got into Parliament. It got into not Parliament. What's the American Parliament? We have a Parliament. What do you got?
Congress?
Congress. Yeah,
We got a Congress.
yeah, whatever
Yeah, it's
those
part of why we have
parliamentary.
the FDA and shit. Why we have like food purity laws. Because people were reading
Exactly.
that book and going, Jesus Christ,
Yeah, and then
there's like
more
human
recently you
hands in
have
my sausages. What the fuck?
yeah, and more recently you have protesters adopting all kinds of pop culture stuff. They've used stuff from Rambo, the 2004 Rambo. That was a big deal in the anti-government rebels in I think it was Laos or Burma rather,
Hmm.
and then you have
Yeah,
the Handmaid's Tale protesters and the Squid Game protesters now, and you have
right,
there are ways in which fiction can impact reality, which is great. I mean, there's no arguing that,
right,
but there's
right,
almost a cultic belief that writing and reading unto itself is activism and it is changing the world, which it is not. It's not doing that. It's not even changing anyone's
right.
mind really, because it all like the Squeecore the Squeecore precept really is that you already agree with everything they're saying because you're also in the same clique. You're in the same economic bracket. You already agree with what they're saying. You're not going to be convinced. You don't need to be convinced. You just need to squee.
Right, right.
Do
So
you hate
there's that
diversity,
self-importance.
Raquel? Why do you hate diversity?
Why do you hate diversity? Oh gosh, it's the worst diversity. Cannot stand it. But so we have this self-importance. We have this incredible precision, bluntness when it comes to giving us the moral of the story. There's a rejection of ambiguity. Motivations must be spelled out. Plot developments must happen on the page without inferences or gaps in the narrative or in the lore. There is no room for negative space. Endings tend toward the tidy and neat, even the pat. But while the moral and all that stuff has to be really, really precise, there's also a weird vagueness. Like I've noticed a lot of the time, Squeecore writers will write three synonyms instead of picking the right word. They'll use two different
Hmm.
metaphors instead of picking which of the one is the best. And I notice a weird vagueness when it comes to details. Like I remember reading one where the main character was this girl who likes reading fantasy books. And at the beginning, she's reading a fantasy book, but it doesn't tell us what the book is.
Ah.
And that's a missed opportunity because if you just gave us the title of a book, that could tell us so much about her taste, about her personality, about what she fantasizes about. There's a really, really
Right.
good opportunity to introduce some kind of theme here. Like, I know it's cliche, but what if she's reading Alice in Wonderland? Then that kind of sets us up for what the story might be. Well, what if she's reading Tolkien? What if she's reading Outlaw of Gore? You know, these all of these things tell us something about who she is, and it's
Yeah.
just a missed opportunity, and you see that a lot, like, when a Squeakcore character eats, they just eat food, they eat dinner or lunch, we don't know what they eat, and again, there's another example where we just with one little word telling us the food
Hmm.
they're eating, that tells us something about them. Like, oh yeah, she had a salad. Like, well, okay, she's very like health conscious. Maybe she's watching her weight. Oh, she had some pizza. Like, okay, that tells us maybe she's not super obsessed with her weight. She had a lean cuisine. Okay, well, we know a lot about someone if she ate a lean cuisine because no one who's ever eaten a lean cuisine has been happy with the way their life is going. That tells us a whole lot. You know, if the character is eating a
I
lean
could
cuisine
vouch for
for lunch,
this.
we know that their life is not the adventure that they want it to be. And it's such a missed opportunity to just name these little details. And I see it over and over and over again.
That's interesting. There seems to be a fear there of being too over precise and over descriptive, and above all they don't want to be purple. They don't want to be accused of being purple. They don't want to be old fashioned in the way that a Lovecraft would be, unless they're parodying him
Mm,
or someone of that
yeah,
era. Because being purple is also a kind of being vulnerable. You want to implant an image in someone's head or many images, and you want to communicate an emotion vividly, which is what purple prose usually does.
yeah,
And you don't want to do that in Squeakcore for
right.
certain.
Emotions are things to be handled in therapy. They're not things to be shared
Yeah.
publicly. They're an embarrassment. They're for lower classes. They're not for us.
They're uncouth.
so,
We cannot be
they're
uncouth
uncouth.
unless
So
we're
we've been
saying
talking. So
we can swear, but we can only say douche waffle, fuck nozzle, cromulent, fuck crustables. You can't just
right.
say fuck
Okay.
yourself.
Okay. So we've been talking about the characteristics of Squeecore.
Fuck
What
off
is
into
Squeecore?
the
Let's talk about
sun.
why is Squeecore? Why is this such a dominant force? We did talk about the economic factors that led to this, but also some of the cultural factors of why Squeakcore is so popular right now. And I think a lot of it is yearning for safety in a world that feels unsafe and unstable. I mean, we're in year two of a global pandemic. The environment is bad. Democracy doesn't look like it's doing super good. It is very understandable to want to cling to stuff that makes you feel good about yourself and makes you feel safe.
Yeah, and that's the excuse they'll use. And I think that's valid. Obviously, I'm not going to take away, like, if you want comfort fiction, it's there. It's good. If it gets you through the day, that's awesome. But I especially think now that people are being raised almost entirely on a diet of that, and that there is almost an inability to see fiction any other way except as to reassurance. It's like they
Yeah.
believe in their hearts that fiction has one rightful purpose, and that's reassurance and safety and relatability. And things that are outside of that are suspicious and maybe contemptuous.
Right. Right. I think there is also a little bit of a factor too. If you are writing, you are competing with a lot more things for an audience. In the old days, your options for entertainment were like read a book, play that game where you chase a hoop with a stick, or like
Mm,
see a vaudeville show. And today you're competing with so many other things. So we're trying to appeal more and more to a narrower group of readers, and I feel like
yeah,
we might have gone leaned into that too hard. There's this core group of fandom, extremely online readers, and we're just trying to write or edit magazines specifically for them in a way that's similar to what gun companies do. They not as many people own guns anymore, so instead of trying to sell a gun to lots of different people, they're trying to sell lots of guns to a small handful of really weird, paranoid gun people. And it kind of feels like the industry is doing that, especially when it comes to magazines. I mean, who reads short fiction sci-fi magazines? Mainly just people who write short sci-fi and want
yeah. The
either are
audience has
published or want to
shrunk.
get published. It's a
I
tiny
mean,
audience. So I understand wanting to appeal to your core audience, but I do think that we might be missing out on an opportunity to appeal to a broader audience that isn't reading it yet, but if, the right story gets in front of them, they might go like, "Oh, wow, that's interesting. I have seen that happen." I noticed when Isabel Falls helicopter story came out, it got a really big response from non sci-fi fantasy people. People
right.
who don't usually read sci-fi fantasy read it and they said, "This is really cool. This is the most interesting sci-fi story I've read in years."
Yeah, and it's hard to argue with that. I mean, even if you do read them all the time, I mean, that's a brilliant story.
Yeah, at least it sure stands out compared to
But
what's
outside of
usually getting
sci-fi
published.
fantasy, I mean, the online sort of controversy, it generally benefits like short fiction. In recent memory, you have Cat Person, that New York story. I think it was New
Oh,
York
yeah.
anyway. Felt like it.
I think it was
And
the
then
New
you had
Yorker, yeah.
Tony Tillamook's The Feminist, that really
Oh my
good
god, yeah, that
incel
one.
one.
That
And these
extremely
are
dark one.
yeah, I love that story. I love yeah, and those are sort of examples of short fiction that have pushed outside of the bounds of people who read short fiction. It reached people who just read blogs or news articles. I thought that was really healthy and really wonderful just to have short fiction discussed in the mainstream,
Right, by
controversially,
normal
people
people.
arguing over it, people trying to find meaning and symbolism and breaking it down, bringing their own critical faculties to it. You do not see that. That is just
No.
not something that happens, but it did happen, and that's wonderful to see. So I guess the question
Oh,
of
so
these
cool.
people, the Squeecore people, is how do you get outside of this cult of this diminishing audience because they're playing the hits, right? They're reassuring their own readers, and they're not really growing
Right.
readership.
It is very much a circle jerk, I think.
Yep.
And one that
Yep.
narrows and narrows and
A
narrows
work
people.
circle
I think
jerk.
people are gonna get sick of it.
It's one of those work meetings.
Yeah.
We've all had them.
Yeah. It I'm
I
just
did have a little thing that I blurted out. Apology if it
yeah, go
seems like
say.
a thought fart, because it is. It is. Who is writing Squeecore? Finlay Dunn said in 1902 that the duty of newspapers was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. The latter day Mexican writer Cesar A. Cruz revived the phrase as art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. It's a quote I've seen countless times, and it's one of those epigrams that we can all basically agree on while arguing about the particulars. So, who in this scenario are the comfortable and who are the disturbed? Contemporary sci fi fantasy seems largely a case of the comfortable writing to comfort the other comfortable. Those who aren't professional authors largely have professional jobs, stability. There are a disproportionate number of white collar government, nonprofit, corporate, academic bureaucrats writing these stories, people in law and in academia, and they're mostly read by peers in similar fields. The sci fi short story market in particular is vanishingly small and rarefied this way, and you absolutely see this professionalization reflected in the awards, the conventions, the workshops, and the work itself. It's an economic clique and a clique of bourgeois manners.
Yeah, it
Applaud.
absolutely does feel that way.
That was hard to read.
It no, it was good, it was good. I think it's a very good soliloquy. But yeah, I agree, I don't have much to add, but yes, I guess I'd say this and then post, an animated GIF of a guy named Chris pointing upward. I forget which Chris it is
Or
that is
downward.
in that
That's the two
particular
options you have for
up
Chris's.
or downward. He's gonna point in some direction, and I can understand on one hand why economically you might do that because there is an incentive to go over this shrinking market, but I feel like we're missing an opportunity and a lot of potential to reach people who aren't in it. And for me, I've given up on appealing to the popular clique in sci-fi. They are not gonna like what I have to
Yeah, I
say.
mean, I have been a dick
But
online for so long and so stridently that they all have me blocked anyway, which is fine.
yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah,
wouldn't read my bullshit either.
but when you see something of yours reach an audience outside of that, it's so refreshing and so exciting and so cool, and you see the Squeecore writers ignoring that potential, like,
Yeah, or they're
well,
mad at it, which of course we've
they're
seen
mad
many.
at it, they pretend it doesn't exist, they get angry, or they, as Tor.com's blog did, write a really watered down version of it without
Oh
attributing
yeah.
it's me several months later. Okay, guys. Um, but
They can
instead of
imitate, but
seizing
they
on
can
an
never duplicate.
opportunity they ignore it, which I find very like, I know I'm gonna sound like an egomaniac, but when Everyone is Beautiful, No One Is Horny got really big, it got such a massive response, and I was blown away and really happy, but I've also been blown away by how much sci-fi fantasy has stridently avoided talking about it, which is it seems very weird. This is a huge thing in discourse, and it's very geeky. It's about superheroes, and it's about
Yeah,
sex, which is I mean, these people write so much slash fiction. They're obsessed with
as
Batman's
they should.
penis, and here's an article all about it. You won't There's a refusal to talk about it. And it's like if I were an editor of, say, like a Tor blog or an SFF magazine that ran editorials, and somebody wrote an article that got translated into like five different languages and was referred to in newspapers all over the fucking world about something
NPR.
in geek culture, I'd be like, I want to talk to that writer. I want that writer. This writer is able to appeal to a lot of fucking people. This writer has something
Hmm.
interesting to say. And to be fair, one of the editors of Fangoria did reach out to me because horror is the superior genre. No one from
It's true.
SFF
It's
did.
true, folks.
Horror is best.
No argument. Horror
Horror
is
is
the
the goat.
best by far.
And it's like because I am not in this clique,
That's it.
they're willing to pass up an opportunity to we reach a broader audience and say something that really excites people. They'll just pass that up because I didn't go to Clarion and I am not in the same fandoms, and that's it. And it's like,
Yep.
what
It's
a
a click. That's
waste.
all it is.
It
There's an in
is,
group
and
and
I'm
an
not
out
in it.
group, and yeah, and they will defend themselves by saying, "Oh, you have to pay your dues as to get into the club. You have to scrape and simper
Right.
and be a courtier like Wuk Chendig." I'm going to say a guy we do not know and do not talk about.
No, never.
But you get on Twitter or social media, you get the blue check, you flatter and you
Mhm.
simper and you simp for years, and you just sort of
You look the
ingratiate
other way
yourself.
while your friends at conventions sexually harass and assault women.
That's right.
You act really surprised when they get caught, You pay
Yeah,
your dues, that's what you do.
pay your due. Be a bro or a
Yeah,
sis or whatever
and
you
that's how
are.
you become a successful male feminist, by ignoring it when your friends harass women. Okay, but we're getting off topic. Gosh, we were talking about clicks and why
Better to
is
be a female
Squeecore.
meminist than a male feminist.
We
I
talked
didn't
about
make any
why is
sense.
Squeecore. Now let's talk about what's wrong with Squeecore. Why are we being so mean to Squeecore? You wrote down a really cool bit that says maybe someone's asking, so what? Is aspirational bad now?
Okay, yeah, I could read that out because
Yeah, do it.
it was a brief note that became a paragraph, and I apologize in
It's
advance.
good. Read it. Read it.
So maybe someone's asking, so what? Is aspirational bad now? And that's the kind of reductive defensive question you'd naturally ask if you believed that aspirational was the only purpose of fiction. The instinct to get defensive about the question means you probably attach a lot of value to that aspirational feeling, that frisson, that nebulous sense of hope. This allows for a lot of great storytelling, yes. But what it disallows is just as interesting. It disallows tragedy and disappointment. It disallows losers, fuck ups, failures, fools, clowns, edgelords, liars, and perverts, and freaks, and criminals, and yes, depraved monsters that you'd never want to be within 100 miles of. Squeecore disallows the unhappy ending, the disappointment, the rawness, the hopelessness, the truth that sometimes you never get what you want, and the discomforting possibility that maybe you don't deserve it. It disallows waste and relapse and pointlessness. In short, it disallows a huge spectrum of the human experience.
Nice. I do
Thank
think
you.
that's an amazing point. And honestly, if you're concerned about diversity, if you're concerned about marginalized voices, you can't fucking gentrify, okay? If you push out the people who are kind of strange and different and people who make you uncomfortable, you're going to be pushing out a hell of a lot of marginalized people. Just think about what happens to a neighborhood when you gentrify it. You end up making the neighborhood incredibly fucking white, don't you? Every single time. So if
Yeah.
you're actually interested in the true spectrum of experience of marginalized people's lives, yeah, there's going to be parts of it that make you very uncomfortable, and there's going to be parts of it that have sad endings or are weird or too raw or too horny. And if you chase that away, you don't have real diversity in your
Hmm.
art. Not really. You have tokenism. You don't have diversity.
Yeah, and I don't use the word gentrification lightly. It's not just cultural; it is an economic thing, specifically because
Right.
as as sci-fi fantasy gets more professionalized and it attracts a certain type of professional, a cynical marketing shark who can write to order for the market. You will see a lot more of these people, and they're out there. I mean, I'm not going to name them, but you know who they are if you're listening to this.
Yeah. You can see a story and go, that's Hugo bait.
It's
That
Hugo
it
bait.
hits the checklist.
It's
This is
like you
Hugo
are.
bait.
This is professional trademark, author trademark. This is what their voice sounds like. This is how they operate, and it's very cynical.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's gross and it works so well. That's what
It
bugs me is
works.
seeing it
That's what.
like,
Yeah.
man, how is anyone being fooled by this bullshit? Oh god. Anyway, so we're mean to Squeecore because it pushes out people, it pushes out the full spectrum of human experience. It pushes out everything that's not Squeecore. It's not enough for Squeecore to say like we don't like gross things. Squeecore has to say these other things are immoral and harmful. And we did a
Hmm.
full episode on this, but in my opinion, calling art harmful is not all that different from calling art degenerate, which is
Yep.
a really, really evil concept. The idea that art is degenerate and we must be protected from it. I find that deeply disturbing, and that concept always ends up hurting queer artists more than anybody else. They're always the ones who
Oh,
get labeled
absolutely.
degenerate fastest. And you could
It was
blame
art by the
economics partially,
marginalized in
maybe.
that museum. Jewish
Yeah.
artists, black artists, jazz, Weimar
Oh
cabaret, which
yeah.
was heavily queer. All that stuff was just labeled degenerate because it did not toe the line of Aryan German morality. And while we don't have Aryan German morality, we definitely have bourgeois morality.
We
There's an
definitely have
economic
American
superiors.
Protestant morality.
Yep.
There is very much a waspiness to it, I think.
Yes.
This to Squeecore, almost a Calvinism in that some people are good and some people are bad, and that's that. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't even leave for the idea of redemption and forgiveness. Even it's not even Catholic. It's Protestant. And Protestant art fucking sucks. As fucked up as the
It's
Catholic
true.
Church is, it's a good aesthetic. Catholic art rocks. I have to admit.
Yeah, the
Terrible church,
Protestants never
really
built a
cool art.
cathedral.
Really, yeah. People
They didn't
people
invent
got
a
mad at
giant
Anne
organ
Rice
that
for
filled the
converting to a
room.
Catholicism for the aesthetic. No, I totally understand. She's a vampire queen. Like
That's the best
Catholicism
reason
is
to
a
do
very
it.
good vampire aesthetic. Yeah, so it's not enough for it to exist, but it has to push everything else out and morally condemn it. And you can't just blame the market for it. I know there are people who want this and people like it, but people like other stuff too. There's a hunger for darker or edgier or more interesting stories. Like in fantasy, A Song of Ice and Fire, a really fucking grim, brutal series is immensely popular. Or Squid Game. I mean,
Hmm.
that was the top TV show. Everybody loved Squid Game. It was this massive international hit. But
And that was out of
within the
nowhere as well.
out of
Just
nowhere, no one
burst out
expected
of
fucking
nowhere.
Squid Game to get big, but it did.
Yeah, because it
So,
spoke to
but
something
in
that we all
short
feel.
SFF, in short sci-fi fantasy, those who write it get frozen out by the influencer clique, or you straight up get harassed out of the industry, like Isabel Fall did. And it's bleak. It's not just bleak for writers, but it's shitty for readers too, because there is a hunger for these kind of stories, and chasing everybody away is a rotten thing to do. Now, I was thinking maybe we should skip the examples of Squeacore because people are going to be mad at me. And well, I
They're
don't know.
already
Let's give a
probably
couple of
mad.
examples. Let's give a couple examples of Squeacore.
Go ahead.
I kind
I
of
have
think the
nothing to do with
Goblin
it.
Emperor. The Goblin
The
Emperor, I
full
think,
mean emperor.
qualifies. Our friend Carlo Jaeger Rodriguez wrote a very, very good review of it in Blood Knife. Chuck Wendig, just fucking Chuck Wendig. Everything he's written, he is a massive Squeecore writer. Joss Whedon and his many imitators. Pretty much, I'm going to say everybody on this past year's Hugo Award short fiction slate, except the helicopter story, kind of falls into Squeecore to me.
Of the ones I've
It's
read,
extremely
yes, but I can't
Squeecore.
speak for all of them.
So let's talk about some contemporary exceptions to Squeacore. And we've been kind of negative this episode, so let's light a candle in the darkness and talk about some contemporary short SFF writers who we think are fucking awesome. I will start with Abby Mayotis. We did a book club episode on her collection Alien Virus Love Disaster Stories. She's really good. She's really like gritty and dark and funny and melancholy. Her stories rock. Ted Chiang. I mean, if you're listening to this, you know who Ted Chiang is, but read some fucking Ted Chiang. Ted Chiang rocks. He's amazing. He's exhaustively well researched. He writes like one short story a year, but it's always this perfect jewel, just an amazing, flawless story that just blows your fucking mind. Carmen Maria Machado, of course, she's brilliant, and she's no longer on book Twitter because she got sick of everybody's bullshit. Good for her. You are free. You are free, Carmen Maria Machado. I'm so proud of you. How about you? Some recommendations from you.
Well, I read a lot of grimdark fantasy, which I'm not going to get super into because that's sort of its own thing. But I'm going to say Gretchen Felker-Martin, of course. I love her work. I've been following
Hell
her
yeah.
for ages. Continual inspiration. Glad to see her meteoric success of late. Peter Watts,
Yeah, she's doing great
reading.
right now.
Yep. More stuff in the Isabel Fall sort of vein, the dark sci-fi. But I do love grimdark fantasy, and that's sort of like recent reads. The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, if I'm pronouncing that right. Don't yell at me like George R. R. Martin, please. I don't know how to pronounce everything.
Yeah.
Um,
Cancelled.
put that sound effect.
JR, fuck off into the sun.
I have fucked off into the sun. Deep apologies.
You're a Canadian, though, so you should be really good at apologies.
I've been apologizing all my life, and I will never stop, and I will always respect my enemies.
Let's see, other short story writers. Porpentine. She's amazing. She does super weird trans body horror. it rocks. She's really, really cool. Someone to check out. And our wonderful friends who've been appearing on our Right Good as guests. We've got Carlo Jaeger Rodriguez. We've got the lovely and terribly underappreciated June Martin. I do not understand why her stories don't sell better than they do because they're fucking amazing. She is the world's
Yeah,
greatest writer.
if you're an
I don't get
agent,
it.
you better buy Accelerate. You better.
Yeah, someone buy Accelerate. It's really good, probably. I haven't read it, but I assume it's good because June wrote it and
She
June
sent
writes
it to me,
good.
and it whips. It's good.
Nice. Ugh, gosh. Let's see.
And
Who
yeah,
else? Who else?
all the Rite Gud crew and the Blood Knife crew. I've never been so inspired to write again as in the last year meeting all of you folks.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not gonna lie. If I hadn't been able to put together this Discord with Blood Knife and Write Good people, I probably would have dropped out of writing just because the community, the mainstream of the community, is so fucking shitty. And it's like, no,
Yeah,
I found a group of gross weirdos to hang out with. This is perfect. We keep each other
and
going.
that's the water. They like maybe they see the water and they don't want to say it's water because they want to be the default. They want to be the no alternative, but
Right.
there is an
And I'm
alternative.
hoping one thing I've been hoping to do and trying to do is to create something of an alternative and say there's other ponds you can swim in.
Yep,
And they're
there's
bigger and
better
better.
waters
There's better water. There's less
with less
grossness in
sharks.
it. Anyway, yeah. All right. So we have been talking for an hour and 20 minutes according to my watch. So why don't we wind it down because this is a long, long episode. Where can our guests find your work and support you?
Well, as of now, not run. I'm the co-host of the Podhand, which is a podcast about mainly Berserk by Kentaro Miura, but also other grimdark and horror topics that are hopefully of interest to Berserk readers and people of anyone who's interested in dark media fiction. And I'm
Nice.
also look for my fantasy novel in the future. That's all I can say about that.
Someday. Well, that is all for this episode. Thanks for listening. Unlike some speculative fiction communities, Right Good is not sponsored by Raytheon. We rely only on our gorgeous listeners. So if you like what you heard, consider supporting us at patreon.com/rightgood. Subscribers get bonus content and access to the Discord, a writing community that is gloriously squee free. Until next time, keep writing good.
This has been Rite Good with Raquel S. Benedict. Hosted by Raquel S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. Theme song by Surgeryhead. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production. For comments and concerns, please write to us at writegud@kittysneezes.com. That is RITEGUD at kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/writegood.
kittysneezes.com in color.